When I Have Passed Away by Joseph Green. This story was twice published in John Carnell's British anthology series, first in New Writings in SF 15 in 1969, then in New Writings in SF 9 in 1972. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel Quasar Spectra. When I Have Passed Away. 1. You have waited too long before returning home, Carnell, were Fiset's first words. Princess Sumze is dying. Halleck Kuusinen saw his lean companion's face turn white for the second time in as many stand-time units. The first had been when Fiset stepped inside the high door of the tall, conical building just off the landing field, where they had retreated from the burning sun to wait for her, and the two men saw that their former classmate was now more than twice their height. The fact that they had expected a size increase was little preparation for the reality. "What's wrong with Sumze?" Halleck asked quickly, putting a hand on Carl's shoulder in quick sympathy. He found himself fascinated by the huge lips and the somber but still beautiful face 2 meters above his own, remembering their warmth and what he had taken for primitive passion when he had kissed them only a few years back. She had stood barely chin-high to him then, and he was a short and sturdy 17 decimeters. "It is not a disease your earthly science can cure, Hal. I used the word dying because you have no equivalent in English. It's actually a period of a very rapid growth, a metamorphosis into a different form of life. I cannot describe it properly in English. You have no words, and you cannot visit her. It is death for any male to see a Shewan woman in her period of change." Fiset stopped fumbling for meaning and shook her huge head in frustration. "It would be best for both of you to remain here until the next ship passes, then return to Earth. I'll show you how to operate the call signal." "I didn't travel this distance to leave without seeing Sumze," said Carl angrily, bristling through the length of his thin frame. "She sent for me. I'm here, and I'm going to see her, with or without your help. Now, where is she?" Fiset's grim expression did not change. "You haven't changed a bit, Carnell. Still ready to protect a low grade or demonstrate against authority, with or without a good cause. Princess Sumze sent for you in a moment of weakness, when she felt the first touches of the long pain. She would not want to see you now." "That's too bad. She's going to," declared Carl flatly. "I've heard tales and rumors about my homeworld all my life. Now I want the truth." Fiset stiffened. "What you need is a good taste of the whip." The slender Shewan man and giant warrior woman glared at each other with a dangerous readiness for violence. Both had hands on their weapons. Fiset wore what was evidently the standard costume of her people, a loose, sleeveless tunic that fell to mid-thigh and was gathered at the waist by a weapons belt. She was armed with a heavy straight sword and 2 daggers. Carl was dressed in normal Earth garb and carried the standard laser pistol issued to Earthmen traveling on primitive planets. It was primarily a defensive weapon, but deadly at short range. Halleck decided he had better intervene before the situation got out of hand. Physically, Carl could pass as an Earthman and had in fact been born and raised there. He had also assimilated Earth's cultural patterns. Only on an intellectual level was he familiar with the fact that his homeworld was a matriarchy, and men little more than slaves. "Will you both calm down and stop acting like children?" Halleck asked, moving between them. They relaxed immediately, looking slightly embarrassed. Fiset was not an ignorant primitive. She had accompanied her princess to Earth, where both completed the final 4 years of their education in a college of the Outworld University especially designed for backward humanoids. Kal had been born to a princess from another state who had not been aware of her pregnancy when she embarked for Earth. Shiwan custom dictated death for both mother and child if a baby were born out of wedlock, and the indiscreet princess had obtained the help of the school in finding her child a foster home. Only when he reached legal age had Kal been told of his true heritage. He had immediately renounced it, preferring to live as an Earthman. Curiosity about his homeworld had led him to seek out Princess Sumze and her companion while taking courses at Outworld in extraterrestrial biology, and he and his best friend were soon dating the very democratic princess and her companion. Halleck and Fizet got along well as Kal and Sumze, and the foursome had been inseparable for a year, until the two women very abruptly broke off in the middle of their last term and returned home. Halleck had taken it philosophically, but Kal had been unable to forget the beautiful princess. 4 years later, he had received a message from Sumze saying she desperately needed him. Both men had just obtained their 3rd degree in biochemistry and were on vacation before reporting to their jobs. Halleck, who had some connections through his father, had got a foundation to sponsor a research trip for them. Now, after 5 tiring months in space, they were being told they could not even see the dying princess. Halleck pointed out to Fizet that she was not being fair to either Sumze or themselves, and reminded her that their advanced training might enable them to help the princess. They had brought an excellent portable chem lab from Earth. Fizet smiled with bitter humor and said, "I was studying biochemistry also, Hal, and though I know the courses given to Outworlders are simplified, I learned enough to know there is nothing Earth science can do for us. I was trying to spare you two a bad experience, but since you insist, I'll take you to our central town, and tonight I'll try to sneak you into the temple. Guards aren't usually posted until the 4th and final night of the change period. You can see Sumze, and I hope you don't spend the rest of your lives regretting it." With that grim warning, Fizet stepped to the door and barked a harsh command. 4 men wearing loincloths entered and picked up the visitors' luggage. They were supervised by a woman a meter shorter than Fizet, carrying both the standard weapons and a whip on her belt. The air outside was hot, humid, rank with the smell of decaying vegetation. The bluish-white sunlight of Achernar flooded its 6th planet with radiant energy, even from a distance of 3 AUs. A multitude of small, thick clouds floated overhead, and a few larger, thinner ones. Halleck noticed that the density of a cloud seemed inversely proportional to its size. Otherwise, he might have been looking up into the skies of Earth in one of the tropical zones. Fizet led them off the small plateau where a thin covering of soil had burned down to bare rock to make a semi-permanent landing field into the thronging riot of vegetation that covered most of this untamed world. They walked along narrow game trails that twisted and turned without apparent direction, but moved them steadily south. In an hour, the intense heat and high humidity had exhausted Halleck, though the gravity was only 0.7 Earth normal. Kal was only a little better off. Fizet and the smaller woman with the whip moved along without noticeable effort. The 4 bearers sweated heavily under their burdens, but apparently were not seriously bothered. At the end of 2 hours, there was a brief rest period, and 3 more of hard marching brought them to the main town of Sumze's tribe. Like the landing field, it was located on raised ground where rock close beneath the surface discouraged plant growth. Dusk was falling when they emerged from the jungle and walked wearily through tall log gates that were shut behind them against the coming night. The town was built in the form of a huge circle, surrounded by a high wall of heavy vertical timbers. Most of the houses were round structures, 8 or 10 meters in height, with conical tops of thatch. In the center of the circle, surrounded by a wide, clear space, was an inverted cone of a building that reared up to a height of 30 meters. There was a faint, murmuring whisper of sound from this one, which Halleck could not identify. Apparently it had no top. Fizet led the way among the buildings. There were no distinct streets. Towards the center, Halleck noticed that the Chouans were a grim, silent, industrious race, even the children quiet as they ran about on myriad errands. All the adult men were about his own size, though muscular and strong from hard work, but the women varied from slim girls to giants, a full 4 meters in height. He saw no one taller than Fizet, however. These people were slightly more primitive than he had consciously expected. They were apparently in transition from the tribe to the state and government and barely past the ability to work steel in technology. Fizet had not talked much about her people, but somehow he had gained a general impression they were more advanced than this, and it was perfectly obvious why the men were in a near-slave status. Any one of the larger women, with her size, strength, and great length of arm, could cut down a dozen men in hand-to-hand combat. Until effective low-range weapons were invented, the men were going to remain in a subservient position. Fizet led them to a large building at the edge of the central cleared area. Protocol demands guests pay their respects to the Queen before sleeping in the town, she announced tonelessly. A high, unguarded door swung open at her touch, and she motioned the 2 men inside. Halleck stepped forward, trying to adjust his eyes to the dimness. He saw a vast, formless body apparently sitting on a massive chair, and then Fizet brushed by him, knelt, crossed her arms in front, and tilted her head far back until the throat was exposed and vulnerable. "Do the same," she whispered at her companions, and the 2 men hastily obeyed. There was a guttural sound from the shapeless mass in the chair, and Fizet abruptly relaxed and sat down on the floor. As Halleck imitated her, he realized that his eyes had grown accustomed to the dusk, and he was looking at the largest woman he had ever seen. The Queen was probably not as tall as Fizet, but she was hugely, astonishingly fat. Completely nude, clothes would have been ridiculous on her bulk. The apparent acres of her skin glistened with a sheen of perspiration. Arms like great barrels hung from massive shoulders, and calves larger than his trunk ran up into the masses of doughy flesh that were her thighs. The abdomen was swollen out of all resemblance to human form, simply a huge central mound of flesh that anchored the extremities. And then Halleck saw the eyes, large as lemons and almost as yellow. There was an alert, incisive intelligence there. The Queen spoke again, and Fizet answered her. The exchange was brief. The tall woman motioned for the men to precede her, and a moment later they were out in the open night. Halleck breathed fresh air again and realized there had been a bad stench in the closed room. Fizet led them to a small building nearby. "Guest quarters," she said, opening the door. "I'll have food sent in. Then get some sleep. I'll be back for you in about 8 hours. She turned and strode away. The single large room contained 4 hide hammocks, 2 immense chairs, and a high table partially covered with rocks. Their gear was stacked in a corner. While Cal poked curiously around, Halleck pulled out the 2 largest cases and opened them. A swift examination indicated that the portable chem lab had survived the trip, undamaged. He sighed with relief. Perhaps they could earn their travel expenses after all. Very little data had been gathered on the life forms on this planet. The door opened abruptly and admitted a white-haired old man, stooped and bent but still muscular, carrying 2 pottery bowls of what appeared to be a hot stew. He placed them on the table and left without a word. There was a pitcher of water already there and 2 drinking bowls. Halleck took one look at the flat stick in his stew and reached into the chem lab for 2 small measuring cups. They made adequate spoons, and the stew, though bland, was rich and filling. Halleck ate with gusto. There was no reason to fear poisoning, and his basic metabolism was so similar to a Chouan's, their food should be easily digestible. Kal, who had certainly had nothing to worry about, appeared to be more fastidious, but he ate it all. Drugged with food and fatigue, they shed their outer clothes and crawled into the 2 lowest of the large hammocks. The last thing Halleck saw before he drifted into exhausted sleep was the odd pile of rocks on the table. Their purpose was evident now. They had started to glow and provided a dim but adequate illumination. Sometime during the 15-hour night, Halleck found himself being roughly shaken and tried to sit up. A huge, firm hand was across his mouth, and Fizet was whispering, "Make no sound. We will all be killed if anyone sees us." She moved to the next hammock and awakened Kal, and Halleck got to his feet and fumbled into his clothes. When Kal was ready, Fizet led them silently out of the door and closed it quietly behind her. She motioned for the 2 men to stand against the wall while she looked carefully around. No moving creature was in sight, and the walls were too distant for the guards patrolling the walkways to see them, even if they were looking inward. When she was satisfied, Fizet led them at a fast walk straight across the open space to the tall building around which the town was apparently built. She checked the area again before opening a small door and motioning them inside. Achernar 6 claimed only 1 moon, but it was large and had a high albedo. Now, close to the western horizon, its milky light was beginning to fade. The town slept peacefully. There was no sound at all, other than a faint, rushing murmur of moving air that seemed to come from the building itself. 2. Fizet quickly closed the door behind them. Halleck saw that the interior of the large building was a single round room over 15 meters in diameter, open all the way up, and it did have a roof of sorts. A huge crystal, more than 2 meters in diameter, was suspended from a network of ropes at the top of the inverted cone. A flood of concentrated moonlight poured through it in a silvery stream, spilling like a fountain of softened sunlight to the floor below. The crystal caught the impinging moonlight on its upper surface, regardless of the angle of incidence, and refracted it almost straight downward. On the ground, this light formed a rough circle, its outer edge matching a round pit that occupied most of the center of the building, leaving a ledge 3 meters wide against the wall. A dazzling, bright fire glow emanated from this pit, rising in a wall of golden-red flame to meet the incoming moonlight. Halleck recognized the glow as similar to that emitted by the luminescent rocks these people apparently used for lighting. The circular depression was evidently filled with them. The outer edge of the great cone of light was clearly defined, but the center was lost in a progressively thicker concentration of moonbeams. The low moan of moving air Halleck had heard outside was coming from deep within the misty interior. As he stood staring, lost in the unexpected beauty of the scene, the mists of light started to shift, to ripple like disturbed water. A vague image seemed to be moving from the hidden interior outward, several meters above his head. He became aware that Fizet was standing beside him, with Kal a few feet behind. She seemed to be silently waiting, watching the coherent pattern slowly drifting towards them, gaining form as it came. The shifting, swirling streamers of light began to move faster, rapidly parting, and suddenly the image was clearly visible. It hovered, suspended in space, so close Fizet could have reached upward and touched it. seemingly formed of mists and swirls of light, insubstantial but clearly recognizable. It was the face of Sumze. Halleck felt his breath catch in his throat. He heard a deep hissing intake beside him and tore his gaze away for a quick look at Kal. The slender Shiwan, head tilted back, was staring as though unable to believe his eyes, his features a study in anguished wonder. Halleck looked back to the face. The eyes were open, staring directly at Fizet, but there was no recognition in them, and the expression was twisted and drawn as if in pain. As he watched the mouth opened, the huge lips curled, and a low moan sounded, as though wintry air were sighing around a corner. After a moment, the great lids closed, hiding the blank, dead eyes. Abruptly, the face moved upward and backward. Rags of vapor and tatters of light rushed between. The feature became vague. Were gone. From somewhere deep within the shining cone there came, again, a low and mournful sigh of pain. Halleck turned back to his companions. Kal looked stricken as though he had been shocked beyond enduring. Fizet seemed grimly amused. After a moment, Halleck broke the silence by asking, "Was that really Sumze in some new form, or an illusion?" Fizet shrugged. "What is real and what illusion?" She kept her voice low, but it seemed to rumble throughout the building. "Princess Sumze is dying, in your terms. In ours, she is making a transition from the solid world to that of the thin, long life. In any case, this is her second night. On the fourth, she will finally be light enough to rise in the air and become a free spirit, living cloud. In the physical terms you are accustomed to, she will transmute from a creature of flesh and blood to one of gas or mist. But it doesn't stop there. The cloud retains a certain homogeneity and a coherent shape for many years, but gradually grows thinner and larger. After 10, 11, sometimes 12 generations, she will expand until her body cannot be seen but fills half the sky, and about that time she becomes so insubstantial we lose contact with her. Somehow she simply goes, and we don't know where or how. In your terms, perhaps one could say, she enters hell here for a few nights, escapes into purgatory and abides there until her sins are washed out by the years, after which she ascends into heaven. There are no words for the cycle that can have meaning for you. The sky outside is filled with our forebears. The larger ones overlap and flow in and out of each other, and the newer ones are those small, thick clouds you see in such profusion. And now you know why ancestor worship is the only form of religion we Shiwans have. We see our gods every day." Overhead, there was a sudden violent boiling in the whirling mists, and the head of Sumze reappeared, this time with a suggestion of gassy shoulders and a nearly firm neck. The head went rushing at the edge of light, seemed to crash against its inner wall as though hitting an impenetrable barrier, recoiled, and again the low, mournful cry of pain went whispering through the building. "Much too soon," Fizet said quietly. "She will have a normal breakthrough on the fourth night. All the warriors will gather here for the elaborate primitive rituals your outworld ethnologists love to record and see her on her way with music and ceremony. Once she is free, the pain will end, and we can communicate with her again, though she won't be very interested in anything we have to say." Halleck found himself shaking his head in dazed disbelief. The experience was too raw to be taken in whole. Kal was almost equally nonplussed, nothing in his heredity having prepared him for this. Fizet took them back to their room. Once inside, Kal recovered enough to ask, "How? If what we saw wasn't just in our minds, How does this change work? And what can we do about it? You can't do anything to stop the change, and I can tell you what happens, but not how or why. A Siwan woman grows very much as yours do, including maturing near the same age. At about 18, translating into your terms, her growth stops and stays stable for about 6 years. This is the time a woman buys her husband, and she has as many children as she can. At 24, she suddenly starts growing again and becomes infertile. In about another 6 years, she reaches her final height, which varies slightly according to heredity. She knows she has reached her full growth because she starts experiencing abdominal pains almost immediately. These go on for months, sometimes a year, and then the change starts. Do you know why the males don't start this second growth period? Halleck questioned her sharply. No. They grow old after lifespans equivalent to yours and die slowly in what I suppose you would call the normal fashion. A woman enters her period of change much more swiftly. She suddenly becomes unable to eat. Her appetite is tremendous during the second growth period, of course, and when she starts throwing her food back up, this means she is in the final 3 days before entering the temple. During this time, her body starts swelling fairly evenly throughout. On the 4th day, the pains change, becoming much worse. These new pains are bad, very strong, and practically continuous. Direct sunlight eases them enough to be bearable, but the nights, 15 hours of unadulterated hell until someone fashioned the first crystal thousands of generations ago. If a woman is denied the right to change in the temple, she sometimes commits suicide or persuades a friend to kill her on that first night of the new pains. It has to be done then. On the second, the body has swollen so much it is no longer a true solid and can't be cut. That's Sumze's condition now. During the daytime, the crystal is covered. It would burn the building down otherwise, and she lies on the cover in the sunlight. Halleck had been trying hard to think of rational explanations for this bizarre cycle as Fizet spoke, but it seemed impossible to make sense of the jumble of information she had given them. He did notice she had failed to mention the pit filled with the luminous rocks and asked about them. The fire rocks strengthen the effect of the condensed moonlight in easing pain and serve as a substitute during the times when neither the sun nor moon is in the sky. Any form of strong light on the skin brings some relief. But, Cal shook his head in angry frustration. Isn't there something that can be done to stop the change? Have you tried to find the cause? Have you tried to find a cause for death? This is our normal cycle, and no one questions it. Even our knowledge of how to cut the large natural crystals we find in the mountains, and so concentrate moonlight to ease the night pains, extends beyond known history. There is a partial antidote, Cal, but it's difficult to use. The fruit of a rare plant that grows near the equator apparently contains a natural drug that retards a woman's second growth rate, and so lengthens her time before the change. It must be eaten daily, though, and taken above a certain amount. It has a major side effect. The queen is our tribe's foremost example of how a greedy person with power can obtain more than her share and prolong her life. But you've seen the result. The body grows tremendously fat, and after a second growth period, about 4 times the length of the normal 6 years, she enters the change period anyway. And there is a penalty to pay. The larger the body, the longer and more painful transition. The queen will require at least 8 nights, and they will be pure torture. Most of us can only obtain enough fruit to keep our second growth uniform and extend our years to about 9 before that first pain tells us we've had it. Then you and Sumze left Earth because you ran out of drug, Halleck exclaimed. Fizet's wide, soft lips curved into a grin. Correct, Hal. Very good guess. The Queen's greed brought on a war with the tribe controlling the route to our closest supply of the fruit. They missed a shipment and we started growing at the normal rate. Sumze decided to leave before you discovered our little secret. We had to do without the drug for over 6 months, though, and when we reached home and started again, it had lost its effect. Sumze is a little older than myself and went first. I'll follow her shortly. I've been having the early pains for several months now. Why didn't you take some fruit samples to the college lab? Try to get the drug analyzed and synthesized in a stronger form, demanded Halleck. Sumze did. Her request was treated as a hoax. We were almost thrown out of school because of it. Halleck remembered the incident, but hadn't known the cause at the time. Evidently, the princess had attempted to tell the full story rather than simply presenting it as a problem in chemistry. She and Fizet had been too human in all measurable ways then for it to be believable. But he and Cal had no choice but to believe their eyes, and the next step was obvious. At his request, Fizet left to obtain some of the fruit, and he started unpacking the portable chem lab with Cal's able assistance. It was too late to help Sumze, but Fizet might still be saved. The two men decided to ignore the more weird aspects of the cycle and treat the search for the active agent in the fruit as a straightforward problem in chemistry. They had certain clues. Its effect was determined by sex. It had to be continuously used, and it was not completely effective. An overdose converted the normal vertical growth to fat to a large extent. At the time of change, body tissues were strongly affected by sunlight, concentrated moonlight, or light from the phosphorescent rocks. That was enough to start on. Fizet returned with the fruit, and Halleck took skin, hair, and internal tissue samples from her for the lab's automatic analyzer. He started to do the same with Cal, and then decided it would be best to use a Shewan male not raised on Earth. Fizet brought them a sleepy, protesting man about their own age, whom she introduced with a cynical shrug as Biel Le Khan, her husband and father of her single child. Halleck was slightly put out to discover he had been dating a married mother during their year together on Earth. Fizet assured him that Sumze was also married, for that matter, and a Shewan female owed no loyalty to the man whom she had purchased for a mate. Some women bought 2 or 3 husbands during their brief period of fertility. This was practical on a planet where men outnumbered women more than 2 to 1, and humane. Unmarried adult males became the property of the queen and lived miserable lives as celibate laborers, released only by death. The two men had maintained their circadian rhythm from Earth, and it was now day for them. They set to work enthusiastically, and by dawn had already acquired a large body of data stored in the lab's small computer. The fruit's edible parts proved to be nothing more than normal, simple sugars, and they had soon ignored them to concentrate on its multitude of tiny seeds. These were more rewarding. Instead of DNA protein, the seed's heredity control was an extremely complex steroid, with the normal carbon skeleton of interlocked rings, and the lab's limited automatic analyzer was incapable of breaking it down. But since steroids were represented in all protoplasm as components of the intrinsic membrane system, and all the sex hormones belonged to the steroid group, it seemed obvious that the molecule must have an affinity for estrogen or one of the other female hormones. It also followed that it would not affect testosterone or the other male hormones, and this the two men confirmed shortly before dawn, after obtaining a sample of testosterone from their reluctant volunteer. Fizet had left them earlier to sleep through what remained of the night. She returned shortly after they stopped work for breakfast with some unhappy news. The Queen did not like the idea of males from a culture where men dominated remaining in her town. She wanted them out that same day, and preferably off the planet. But Halleck gestured at the profusion of equipment scattered around the room. "But we have to have some place to work, Fizet. It's too long a walk back to the station. I've already thought of a house for you. There's a good, clean building a short distance away where young men are kept from the time a woman pays the purchase price until the wedding. It's empty, and you should be safe there. I'll send Beale with you, and come myself when I can." Halleck shrugged and accepted the inevitable with good grace. They were packed and out of the town within 2 hours, this time carrying their own equipment with the help of Fizet and Beale Lecan. The waiting hut was in the jungle, but it was well maintained and clean. They set up the lab again, ate some of the food stored there, and went back to work. Fizet returned to town. By midday, both men were exhausted by hard labor in the intense heat. They decided to take a short nap and work till dark. At sundown, they were content to eat a quick meal and stretch out on the hammocks for some needed rest. 3. Sometime during the night, Halleck was jarred from sleep by a cry of terror and sat up on the hammock, senses still foggy, to see Beale Lecan on the floor in front of the door, grappling furiously with a strange warrior woman only a little larger than himself. A second woman, a giantess almost as tall as Fizet, was hovering over the pair, sword poised, and behind her 2 more were crowding into the doorway. Before Halleck could move, the giantess found an opening, and the flat of her heavy sword landed on Beale Lecan's head. He collapsed, and the larger woman turned towards the 2 men from Earth, lifting her blade in a way that made it clear she did not intend to use the flat part again. The 2 warriors in the doorway behind her, also with swords drawn, were advancing behind their leader, while the smaller one on the floor was scrambling to her feet. There was no time to argue or attempt to dissuade the women from what was obviously a planned murder. Halleck reached for his laser, lying on the table a few feet away, and saw that Kal was doing the same. He slipped the safety catch off with his thumb, aimed between the feet of the advancing woman, and pulled the trigger. He saw that Kal was covering the warrior moving towards him on that side of the room, but had not yet fired. There was a high hiss of heated air, and the wooden floor charred and burned. The big woman ignored it and drew back her sword for the thrust that would sink it deep in Halleck's stomach. He raised the beam without releasing the trigger and hit her arm. With a cry of pain and fury, she dropped the long blade, snatched a knife from her belt with her other hand, and sprang so quickly he had time only to swing the beam to her face before she was on him. It caught her across both eyes, turning them instantly into blackened cinders. Momentum carried her forward, but she was collapsing when she reached him. There was a shout of warning from Kal, and Halleck turned to see another warrior almost close enough to strike. The smaller woman who had tried to silence Beale Lecan had a dagger drawn, but seemed uncertain which man to attack. The tall Amazon on Kal's side of the room suddenly jumped him, attempting to reach the laser with her sword, and Kal burned her down. The brief second that Halleck had let his attention stray from his own opponent was enough. He turned back to find her launching herself towards him, that long sword leading the way, and there was nothing he could do but hurl himself backward on the hammock and kick frantically at the glistening steel. One foot caught the blade midway and sent it angling towards the ceiling. Then the woman's momentum carried her over and on him. The hammock tore loose, and they went to the floor in a tangled heap. He felt buried in a mass of woman flesh, and it was not the pleasant experience a man might have expected. Great hands clawed for his throat, and one reached it before he reluctantly placed the pistol's emitter against her side and pressed the guarded trigger. The stink of burned flesh filled the air, and she collapsed on top of him and lay still. Halleck got his head clear just in time to see the smallest woman fleeing out the door. Carl was standing by his hammock, laser in hand, but he did not fire. She vanished into the night, and it was suddenly deadly quiet in the hut. The stillness lasted only a moment before it was broken by a groan of pain. Halleck pushed his way from beneath the dead warrior and scrambled to his feet. Carl was already bending over the first woman, who was clawing feebly at her ruined face. He turned from her and examined Bia Lacan, who was apparently only unconscious. The giantess had struck with precision. Carl turned back to the woman. "I'll do it if you don't feel up to it," he volunteered, but his voice was sick. Halleck shook his head and stepped to the woman's side. The briefest examination indicated that Carl was right. The giant warrior was dying from pain and the shock of her injuries. He placed the emitter against the back of her neck, steeled himself, and yanked the trigger closed. She jerked violently, stiffened into rigidity, then relaxed in death. Fizet and a large group of fighting women arrived less than 5 minutes later, swords in hand, obviously expecting to find them hacked to death. She spared a brief glance for Bia Lacan, who had recovered enough to sit erect and quickly brought them up to date. The Queen had had them followed that morning and ordered the murder party after them at dark. Fizet had been imprisoned for disobeying orders, but her clan had broken her out in the night, killing the guards as they did so. They were now in open revolt. Resentment against the greedy queen had been simmering below the surface for some time, but the expected assumption of the throne by Sumze, who was immensely popular, had kept the warrior women waiting in patience. Now that Sumze was dying, ending the direct succession, Fizet and a younger cousin in the next town had equal claim to the crown. Fizet was on her way now to arrange an alliance and yield her claim, since she would be going into the change period shortly anyway. They had detoured by the waiting hut in the faint hope the assassins might not yet have struck. Halleck noticed that Fizet's companions were eyeing the 2 men and 3 dead women in a discomfited and puzzled manner. They were familiar with lasers, but evidently felt that the modern weapons were not enough to overcome the handicap of being men. They did not understand how the brief battle had ended in female defeat. There was a short, noisy conference, with Fizet's interpreting for her clan sisters. Halleck managed to get across a recently discovered fact, that he urgently needed a sample of the gaseous body of Sumze for the analyzer, and his request brought a grim smile to Fizet's lips. She said, "Our best chance of defeating the Queen lies in gathering all our sympathizers and striking tonight, before she has time to rally her own clan. The temple will be our first target. It's the source of royal power. I think we can get that sample, and with luck you can say goodbye to Sumze before she breaks free." With the help of the big women, the 2 men moved their equipment into the jungle, hiding it from all but a thorough search. The Queen might dispatch another party when the lone survivor returned, and the hut was no longer safe. It was still several hours before daylight when they set out for the town where Fizet's cousin ruled. The bright moonlight above the treetops completely failed to reach the game trails, and after the first slow kilometer, Fizet impatiently picked up Halleck and cradled him in her arms. 2 more of the largest women did the same for Carl and Bia Lacan. He lay cuddled against the great soft bosom and felt humiliated, but their speed doubled. Shortly after sunrise, they reached the town, and Fizet left the 3 men in the care of her women while she went to talk to her cousin. Evidently, intrigue and revolt were as much a part of life for primitive matriarchies as for their male counterparts on Earth. Fizet was back within the hour, having reached a full accord with her cousin and briefly described their next step before retiring for some needed sleep. The clan was being summoned from all surrounding towns. They would meet at an agreed spot outside the Queen's walls that night and attack just before the first changing of the guard. Unless the Queen had acted faster than anticipated, they stood an excellent chance of scaling the wall and taking the town. Events were moving with such speed and had become so completely out of their control that both Halleck and Kal were feeling more like spectators than participants. Halleck was beginning to think of the trouble he might be in when word of this affair reached authorities on Earth. Kal, at least, had retained his citizenship and was unlikely to suffer legal penalties. Halleck had his career to think about. There was scant time available for reflection. Shortly after noon, the town's full complement of warriors moved out, taking the two men from Earth with them. The Shewan possessed no distance weapons of any sort, and the two lasers might be useful. Fizet was leaving to recruit more warriors from her hometown, where she had great influence. They arrived at the meeting point without incident to find several groups of armed women already there, and more arriving steadily. The depth of the Queen's unpopularity was becoming apparent. Several other clans had thrown in with the rebels. Fizet arrived just before the time agreed on to move out, and she brought the largest single group yet. As temporary warlord, she had little time to spare for the men, but did manage to tell them that the attacking force now slightly outnumbered the Queen's defenders. The great Fat One had sent for warriors from her clan among the nearby towns, as expected, but as yet none had arrived. Halleck and Kal discussed the idea of producing an explosive to shatter a portion of the wall, but found that it could not be done in the time available. Fizet had also been thinking, and after a brief talk with Halleck, convinced him that her plan was sound. Reluctantly, he agreed to try her suggestion. An hour later, the two men, Fizet and 40 warriors, were crouched in the jungle shadows at the point where the woods most closely approached the wall, waiting for the agreed time. Halleck noticed that the sky was steadily darkening with an accumulation of large, thin clouds slowly but surely diffusing, and then cutting off the bright moonlight flooding the ground between themselves and the wall. Fizet saw his puzzlement. There had never been a cloud in the sky around the temple before, and said, "Some of our clan ancestors, Hal. I summoned them. I'm talking to them now through a kind of, you would probably call it telepathy. I can't really explain what we need, but it isn't necessary. When a few more gather, it will be dark on this entire side of the town, and that's all we require." Her prediction was confirmed within 10 minutes. When the darkness was complete, she led Halleck and Kal to the wall, moving stealthily, all three covered with black cloaks. They reached the embedded logs without incident and stood flattened against them, trying to locate the position of the guards on the interior walkway. Their ears soon told them that the guard had been doubled and were patrolling in twos to prevent just such an attempt as they were about to make. The unusual darkness had made them nervous and extra alert. Halleck felt huge but still soft lips against his ear, and remembered for the 100th time how they had felt pressed to his own. "The ladder is ready. I'll throw Kal up first. He will hold them back while you pull up the main loops and attach them, and then both of you must keep the area clear long enough for several of us to reach the walk." Halleck nodded in numb anguish, thinking of the women he would be killing in the next few minutes. Somehow he simply could not bring himself to think of them as bloodthirsty savages, despite his certain knowledge that such an attitude could cost him his life. He checked the 3 guide ropes attached to his belt. All were secure. Fizet had dropped to one knee, facing the wall. She cupped her hands, and Kal stepped into them, gathered his balance, and said, low-voiced, "Now!" Fizet heaved her great body erect, and Kal shot into the air, almost brushing the wall as he ascended. This was a common practice the warrior women had long ago worked out, where the great size differential between a new adult and a giantess like Fizet could be put to good use. Her control was perfect, and Kal reached the top of his rise just above the wall, only inches away. He wrapped his arms around one of the sharpened logs, hung for a brief second, and then scrambled over and out of sight. Fizet had again dropped to one knee. Halleck hastily stepped into her hands, braced himself, and said the word. An instant later he was flying upward at violent speed, his senses confused and lost by the motion. He was heavier than Kal, and Fizet, knowing this, had overcompensated. He went past the top, stopped, and started to fall. Fortunately, she had placed him precisely against the wall, as she had Kal, and he was able, at the top of his rise, to orient himself. He grabbed at one of the timbers as he descended. His arms were almost dislocated at the shoulders when they took his falling weight, but he managed to retain his grip and a moment later climb over and drop to the walkway. He found Kal waiting for him. The smaller man's smooth ascent had not been noticed, but his own had been more noisy. There were sharp calls coming from the patrol that had just walked by, apparently asking who had made the sounds. He ignored them and hastily began pulling up the first guide rope. In a moment, he held the loop of one end of the wide rope ladder and dropped it over an upright. Loosening the slip knots on the other two, he walked 2 paces towards the oncoming guards, holding the ropes above the tops of the posts, and then held the third in his teeth while he pulled up and anchored the second loop. As he started to move towards the guards, again a laser beam flashed past his side. There was a grunt, followed by a cry of alarm. He ignored it and started pulling up the final rope. The laser flashed again, and now he was smelling burned flesh from the first, where she had crumbled just a few feet away. The third loop was in his hands, and he pulled the ladder sideways until it was taut before slipping it over the top of a post. "Come up, Fizet!" he yelled, and drew his own laser. Halleck's first beam was towards the woods to tell the waiting warriors that the wide rope ladder was securely anchored. The second was towards the woman, barely taller than himself, who was almost upon him when he turned to defend his end of the ladder. She crumpled without a sound. The entire area was alarmed now, the word being shouted to all guards that a scaling attempt was in progress. Feet were pounding the walk towards them from both directions, and a general alarm was being raised in the town below. Halleck crouched against the wall, dropped to his knees, and wrapped his cloak about him. The next guard to reach his end carried a pitch torch, but its light blinded as much as it aided her. She did not see him until far too late. An oncoming warrior stumbled over her crumbling body and fell to the ground below. The flashing beams and the stink of burned flesh alerted the other defenders to the fact they were facing lasers, and the next two came more cautiously. Halleck, conscious that his gun's charge must be growing weak, declined to fire as long as they hung back. After a moment he heard someone behind him and whirled, bringing the laser to bear when he saw it was a giant woman. Something about her attitude, her sword was not poised for attack, told him it was Fizet. She crouched down beside him, and he turned back to defending the ladder. The two hesitant warriors were reinforced and finally charged en masse, 6 of them coming 2 abreast. Halleck burned down the larger of the two, who was closest to the wall. The intense light evidently blinded her companion, and Fizet sprang erect and disposed of her in a single easy thrust. The next two followed immediately, springing over the bodies of their fallen comrades, and one almost reached Halleck before his beam took her in the throat. He heard a laser hissing steadily behind him and knew Kal was under the same heavy attack. Fizet killed her second opponent after a brief clash of swords and a third who pressed forward behind her. The last woman, who had got close by, staying slightly behind her companions, jumped over the two laser-burned warriors who had shielded her, and Halleck fell backward to avoid the first sweep of her sword. She got no second chance. Fizet almost decapitated her with a slashing blow from the side. The first woman of Fizet's clan dropped to the walkway beside them, to be followed by others in a steady stream. Halleck and Cal stayed where they were, according to plan, as the rebels swiftly consolidated their hold on the area and started advancing towards the nearest stairs. The fighting grew heavier, but the two men kept well back out of it, holding the diminished lasers for the final dash to the temple. That came in a few minutes, when they had reached the ground, and Fizet was satisfied that the battle was going well. A picked group pulled back from the advancing line, and with the giantess leading the way and the two men in the center, they moved off among the houses. Fizet took them swiftly away from the din of the main battle, though they killed two warriors just emerging from their homes as the rebels passed and finally paused at the edge of the open ground surrounding the temple. The area was almost deserted, the town's entire fighting force being on the walkways or attempting to stem the advance of Fizet's troops on the ground, and the giantess waited only a moment before leading them in a hard run towards the temple's single door. There were 8 guards defending it, and the clash lasted several minutes before the last one fell. Fizet, now bloody from head to foot and with one arm dangling uselessly, opened the door and stepped inside, motioning for the other women to wait. Halleck and Cal swiftly followed her, to find the scene much the same as before, except that the writhing, whirling gas cloud that had been Sumze appeared more often in the thin outer edge of moonlight. It was so tenuous and ethereal it had lost all trace of human form, and was moving about with greater abandon, swinging constantly from side to side, like a ghostly imprisoned bird beating hard at the walls of light that were its cage. 4. "Almost ready," Fizet said calmly. "We're barely in time. Give me your sample vial." Halleck dug the small flask out of his pocket, and Fizet sheathed her sword, took the vial in her good hand, and stood poised. A minute later she reached out and swung it rapidly through the thinner outer layer of intensified moonlight, and Halleck saw the nebulous, misty form of Sumze rising just above her hand. Fizet swiftly capped the glass and handed it to Halleck. Inside he saw a curling, roiling twist of vapor. There was a sudden, renewed clash of arms at the door. The clanging of many swords indicated heavy fighting. Then the door opened, and the most monstrous creature Halleck had ever seen sprang inside. It was the Fat Queen, her 1,000 kilograms of blubber moving with the ease and lightness of a young warrior, a sword as long as Fizet's in her bloated hand. The great mass of her face was twisted into a fighting snarl, and it was obvious from the strength and vigor of her movements that, like many fat people, her bulk was supported by an immense foundation of solid muscle. She advanced immediately, the long sword ready for slaughter, and Fizet drew her own in a smooth motion and started forward. Halleck had drawn his more deadly weapon, but Fizet motioned it down. "No, she's mine." Cal moved to stand beside Halleck, and the two men watched the fighting women approach each other warily, the sword points darting forward and colliding in a deadly test of strength. The sound of fresh combat came from the still open door, telling the men the main rebel body had at last reached the temple and engaged the Queen's followers. They had almost eliminated Fizet's advance force. There was little room for two such large women to maneuver on the comparatively narrow apron surrounding the ring of fire rocks. Fizet drew back after 2 parries and feinted a low blow at the vast column of a leg. The queen danced backward with unbelievable agility and instantly surged forward again to hammer a hard overhand blow at Fizet's exposed head. She caught it on her sword, but her blade was forced downward, and the queen's edge cut into her already wounded shoulder. Fizet retreated for a moment as she drew erect, blood streaming from the new cut, and then took advantage of her slightly longer reach and brought the queen to a halt with a series of rapid jabs. Abruptly she changed her tactics and sprang hard to the side, her wounded shoulder jarring against the wall, penetrating the queen's guard for a second with a swift step forward and back. Halleck saw the sword point enter the vast forward mound of belly, but Fizet was moving backward and had to continue the motion, and the bloodied end came out again. The queen hardly noticed the wound. She bounded after Fizet with undiminished energy, and the tall warrior suddenly stood and fought hard. For a brief moment the 2 women battered swords with a rapidity that defied the eye, and then Fizet succeeded in cutting a great slash across the bulging stomach, and an instant later did it again. Even through the vastness of her bulk, the queen felt the mortal wounds, and suddenly changed her tactics and charged directly into Fizet's waiting point. The wounded woman sank her sword to the hilt, but missed the heart, lost in the tremendous barrel of the abdomen, and the queen brought her blade around in a slashing cut into Fizet's side as she fell. A second later, both combatants lay stretched on the floor, bleeding profusely. Halleck ran to Fizet's side and knelt to examine her wound. The queen's final swing had entered below the ribs and penetrated almost to the backbone. Fizet was dying. Halleck cradled the huge head of his former sweetheart in his arms, aware there was nothing he could do, aware even more poignantly that this fierce warrior woman was not the same quiet, loving companion to a princess he had known on earth. That woman had died when Fizet returned home, and he could feel only a strange numbness towards this one. He held her as he might have held and comforted a dying friend of the same sex, and had no desire to kiss the big soft lips in farewell. Somehow Fizet sensed his feelings and smiled in bitter forgiveness. She had lived as a Siouan warrior woman most of her life, and now she would die one, unmourned by any man. But the lessons of civilization she had learned in school and on earth were strong, and she clutched at Halleck's shoulder, staring fixedly into his eyes. "Hal," she said hoarsely, and again, "Hal." He waited through a moment of heavy breathing, and then, "I want you to... my son. Take him back with you to Earth. I don't want him... grow up another Biel-Lacan. If you can solve this, start sexual equality, stop constant tribal fighting." Her head abruptly sagged to the side. Fizet was dead. There was a high, whistling cry of pain from overhead. Halleck glanced up, startled. Kal was silently pointing to the top of the building, where the thick moonlight seemed in agitated motion. As Halleck watched, in frozen wonder, the face of Sumze formed in the cloud, clear and almost precise in detail. Her eyes were closed, and the expression one of rage or pain. The face seemed to turn and sweep back out of sight in the cloudy light, with a suggestion of a rounded body following it. An instant later it reappeared, now faded into a circular cloud, and butted hard at the edge of the moonlight, pushed through and fled upward towards the net of rope. The main body followed, overtaking the leading promontory, the whole swiftly assuming the unusually rounded, even shape of the clouds they had noticed so frequently in the sky on their arrival. An instant later the misty shape passed through the maze of ropes and fled from sight. A soft, gentle moan of moving air lingered behind, swiftly fading into silence. Blood and death had been substituted for the normal music and chanting which formed the rites of passage for a pagan princess, but the end was the same. Sumze was gone. Halleck pushed back from the computer's visual display glass with a weary sigh. He had run the final computations through for the third time, and the answer had come out the same: insufficient data. He would have to take his seeds, tissue samples, and captured gas from Sumze's body back to Earth and a full-size analyzer. They had at least identified the hormone that caused the Shawan female's strange growth cycle. It had not been estrogen, after all, but a slightly less complex steroid for which they had no name. It apparently had little to do with sexual characteristics, though it was produced in the ovaries and thus found only in females. The analyzer had broken its molecular code without undue difficulty once it was isolated, but the interactions with the human body and the curbing effect of the drug were beyond its capacity. To effect a cure, they would have to return to Earth. Cal entered and took a seat. Halleck glanced at him and saw that he appeared tense and nervous, but was wearing a rather strained smile of satisfaction. It was still comparatively early in the morning, and Cal, for some reason, had decided to continue working after Halleck quit the night before. He had not been around when Halleck wolfed down his breakfast and activated the computer for the final attempt to break the interaction cycle. Fortunately, they were at a point where one man could work alone. "Where have you been?" Halleck asked quietly, sensing that something was wrong. "In the temple, and I'll have to go back shortly. The pains are pretty bad out of the sunlight." "What?" But the answer was obvious, and Halleck let the question die on his lips. He glanced at the table, where they had prepared a large sample of the mysterious hormone by a reduction process on the more complex but similar drug from the plants. It was gone. "Why, Cal? What are you trying to prove? Look, if you take the drug straight in a large enough dosage, maybe we can reverse the—" "But I don't want it reversed," Cal interrupted him. "I've made my decision. I'm going to join Sumze, the first male in Shawan history to make the transition." He smiled in self-mockery. "And I did it because I had a chance to stop and think, Hal. We were so busy trying to solve the problem and then fighting the war that we failed to check our assumptions. I finally did, and I don't like them. Look, it seemed natural to you and to myself, because of my Earth training, to consider this odd growth cycle an undesirable quality. But is it, really? It may be painful, but so is birth, and birth propels the infant into a new life. The change also starts a new existence, and it's one that endures for 10 or 12 generations. We have no comparable afterlife on Earth, not unless the old ghost stories are true after all. What benefits do the Shawan females gain from their new forms? We can only guess. We do not know they become disinterested in human affairs, but they still communicate with their children. I think they are exploring a new world with new sights, sounds, and sensations, and they draw further and further away from us because we remind them too much of their old and limited bodies. I think perhaps we should be working to adapt the males here to assume the same growth pattern, not to cure the females. I'll soon know for certain. The pure hormone works fast, and it isn't necessary to reach any certain growth when you have it. I'll be joining Sumze in 2 or 3 more nights." "You idiot! That's all guesswork. You may die instead, and those clouds may be mindless, drifting shapes with just enough life in them to respond to a telepath. How could you make such a wild decision?" "I felt that someone had to, and I'm the logical choice. Now stop arguing and gather up your gear. The next ship is due in shortly. Take Biela Khan and Fizay's son back with you. Solve the problem and be back a year from now. I promise, no matter what the attractions of my new shape, that I'll communicate with you, and then we'll know whether to cure the women or change the men. That's the way it must be, Hal. Kal heaved himself erect, grimaced with pain, and moved heavily towards the door. Halleck watched him go, momentarily stunned. As Kal opened the panel, he sprang forward to seize his partner and talk some sense into his stubborn head, but Kal stepped quickly outside. Halleck was stopped at the door by a drawn sword in a huge female hand. 2 warriors were waiting there. He stood and watched Kal, bent over with the torture that was racking his body, hobble towards the temple. Not one of the many women milling around attempted to stop him. The rule that no man might enter the Temple of Pain and Transition had been waived for Kal. The Shawan customs were already changing. Halleck turned back into the room and began rapidly assembling his equipment. A year was a long time to wait, but he would manage. And with the scientific resources of Earth at his disposal, he could do a thorough comparison of the Shawan and Earth males, learn precisely what was happening to Kal, and what would happen to him if he took the same drug as he began to grow old. Perhaps... You've been listening to pre-1990s speculative fiction readings with a highlight on science fiction by Darrell T. Smith II. Please consider clicking the donation link in the description box. Thank you so much for your time and your imagination.